All right. I'm going to go ahead and welcome everybody and get us started this morning. Thank you so much for joining us, everyone. This is the third day of Tipping Point, Connecticut's first affordable housing conference series. I'm Kylie Goslin. I'm the executive director here at the Partnership for Strong Communities. And throughout the week, we're hosting over 30 sessions featuring local, state, and national experts leading conversations that explore challenges, share best practices, and coalesce us around critical next steps to address key affordable housing issues here in Connecticut. You can join the conversation about Tipping Point at hashtag TippingPoint2020 on Twitter and follow us at PSC Housing if you aren't already. So we're so excited this morning to welcome Alan Mallach as our keynote. Before we turn it over to him, I want to express our deep thanks to our leading sponsors, the Connecticut Housing Finance Authority, and as always, the Melville Charitable Trust. And also thank you to our collaborating sponsor, the Connecticut Department of Housing, and to our supporting housing sponsors, Housing Enterprises, Inc. and Whittlesey. All right, so before, again, I turn over to Alan, a couple housekeeping items. We're in a webinar format and this session is being recorded. So in a webinar format, that means that we won't be able to see you. You'll be muted for the entire session. You'll remain on mute unless a presenter has asked you to unmute. If you have a technology issue during this session, please use the chat icon at the bottom of the screen. Just let us know you're having a tech issue and we'll do our best to help you resolve it. We're going to ask for this particular session, for Alan's question and answer session, that you use the question and answer icon at the bottom center of your screen. We'll be monitoring that. So please don't put your questions for Alan in the chat, put them in the Q&A function. If we have links and things like that to post, we will put those in the chat function as well. A few minutes before the end of the session, we're going to be launching a poll that asks for your feedback on this session. Please take a minute and share and help us improve our future webinars and conference offerings. And then lastly, the partnership is working to better understand the needs of our communications and affordable housing partners. We want to learn from you. So towards the end of the session, we're going to post a survey link in the chat. We really would love it if you would take the 5 minutes to complete that survey. It's really going to help us take a look at and restructure and think about how we want to move Home Connecticut, our affordable housing campaign, forward. All right, and with that, I'll happy to introduce our keynote speaker today, Mr. Alan Mallach. So for those of you who are unfamiliar, Alan is a senior fellow at the Center for Community Progress. He's a city planner, an advocate, and a writer. He's nationally known for his work on housing, economic development, and urban revitalization. And he's worked with local governments and community organizations across the country to develop creative policies and strategies to help rebuild cities and neighborhoods. Alan's no stranger to municipal government himself. He's the former director of housing and economic development in Trenton, New Jersey. And he now regularly speaks and writes on housing and urban issues in the United States as well as abroad, and is a frequent contributor to Shelter Force and other publications. His recent books include The Divided City, A Decent Home, Planning, Building, and Preserving Affordable Housing, and Bringing Buildings Back from Vacant Properties to Community Assets. If you haven't read The Divided City, I cannot recommend it enough. I've personally read it multiple times myself and find that its insights on the intricacies of cities, their people, structures, markets, and economies throughout history provides such a rich understanding of the complexities and potential solutions for many of the challenges that we've been discussing throughout this conference. So he's a personal hero of mine, so it's such a joy to introduce him. I know he's prepared some excellent Connecticut-specific content for you today, which is really exciting. And if it's anything like his presentation at our December 2019 iForum, it will definitely have you thinking of new ways, thinking in new ways and finding some aha moments about material that you already thought you knew well. So without further ado, I'm going to turn it over to Alan.
Great. Thanks, Kylie. And if you will share your screen,
I will.
We'll get started.
Right.
Okay, well, what I'm going to talk about today is about how to densify suburbs in a way that I think can work and actually benefits the suburbs as well as addressing the housing needs. And I believe this is possible. I may be a Pollyanna. I've spent the last 50 plus years thinking about what might be possible. And I think this is worth at least considering. First, I'm going to talk a little bit first about the housing needs, about, next slide, please. The next slide. Did I just lose? I just lost Kylie.
I'm not able. There we go. Okay.
There we go. Yeah. Excuse me. Okay, I'm going to talk about the affordability housing crisis, about the changes in American households that are very significant and have a tremendous bearing on what kind of housing we need and what kind of housing we built, and the fact that housing production has lagged behind the need. Next slide. And then I'm going to talk about how we can address this. Now, I'm not going to belabor the issue of the affordable housing crisis. We know there's a crisis. We know half of all renters are cost burdened. And we know, next slide, please, that this crisis is as real, if not more so, in Connecticut than in the rest of the United States. So we need to do something about it. Okay, that's the first point. Secondly, yeah, go on. Next. Yeah. Secondly, there have been some huge changes since we started to build suburbs and since we came up with the template for what the American suburbs should look like. Back in the 50s and 60s, most American households were married couples, and most of them raised children. Almost half of all the households in the United States were married couples raising children. Today, it's 1 out of 5. There weren't very many single individuals living by themselves, mostly elderly widows or widowers, few people in what were used to be called skid rows, not many other people. People tended to marry very quickly, very young, and start their families young. Today, the share of single individuals has gone from 15% to almost 30%, 35%. Almost 1 out of 3 households in the United States is a single person living by themselves. And obviously, single parent families, who were virtually non-existent back in the day, are now 1/3 of all families with children. Next. So families are also smaller. The 3-child or more family, which was relatively common 50, 60 years ago, is now a rarity. So we have fewer families with children, only 1 out of 5, and the families with children have fewer children. So we have smaller families. Next. The other thing that's happening is that the population is aging. In 1960, only 9% of all Americans were over 65. Today, it's 16%. 20 years from now, it's expected to be 22%. Almost 1 out of every 4 residents. So, and the interesting thing particularly is if you look at where the growth in America's population is going to be over the next 20 years, almost 2/3 of that is going to be in elderly people, senior citizens like myself. So families are smaller. There are fewer families with children. There are more elderly people. There are more single-person households. Now, single-person households today are not just elderly people, because now it's customary for young people to marry much later than they were marrying 40, 50, 60 years ago. So we have lots of young single people, young couples, people in informal arrangements, sharing houses, a whole different set of housing demands that we had when our suburbs were first developed and we created the template for America's suburbs. Next. In the meantime, we're simply not building enough housing, period. According to the most fairly conservative estimates, we need to be building nationally about 1.5 million housing units a year to meet the demand for new households, as well as the replacement of housing units that are demolished or become obsolete or are taken off the market for one reason or another. Well, the fact is, since the end of the housing bubble and the Great Recession, we have not hit that number in any one year. Even in 2019, when we had close to full employment, we had the lowest interest rates in modern history, we still didn't come up with enough housing to meet the full demand. So that's one of the reasons why prices are going up. That's one of the reasons why people have a harder and harder time finding housing. And again, if we don't do something, this is going to become a permanent condition that's going to get gradually more and more severe with every passing year. Next. So here's the crux of the problem. We have millions of households who can't find housing that they can afford. We're not producing enough housing, so things are gradually getting worse. A lot of our existing housing simply does not meet the needs of the household mix that lives in the United States today, because it was based on a template for an America that was true maybe 50, 60 years ago, but is no longer true. And when we look at what the impediments are to meeting these needs, I mean, there are a lot of impediments. And I'm not going to suggest that you do any one thing and we're going to solve the problem. But I would argue that suburban land use controls are the single greatest impediment. Not the only one, but the single greatest, because they basically restrict the extent to which we can produce enough housing and produce housing that is responsive to the needs of today, rather than, again, their needs of many years ago. And the second point, next slide, please, is that the suburbs themselves are facing enormous challenges, a lot of which grow out of the fact that they are still operating on the basis of an obsolete template. The first thing is property taxes are extraordinarily burdensome. Connecticut suburbs, which are largely reliant on residential property taxes, have extremely burdensome property tax rates, even by comparison, as the graph shows, to relatively high tax neighbors like Massachusetts and New York. A lot of suburbs, not all of them, but many suburbs are facing adverse competitive pressures because their older housing stock is not as appealing as it once was, and that people are moving even further out to newer housing, leaving older suburbs behind. I don't have to belabor the point about the reliance on the automobile, the sprawl, the fiscal costs, and the environmental challenges that that creates. So suburbs are under a lot of challenges as well. And again, exclusionary land use regulations block efforts that could address these issues and ameliorate the problems of taxes, market pressures, and sprawl. But first, what do we mean? Let me show you an example of exclusionary zoning. Next. This is a town in Connecticut, town of Oxford. Maybe some of you are familiar with it. I picked it semi at random to try to find an outer suburban town that was yet relatively close to a major center. And then, now this is an interesting zoning map, and I don't mean to pick on Oxford. I'm sure there are lots of other towns that are similar. No multifamily housing is allowed as of right. in Oxford. There's some provisions for special exception, but no multifamily housing is allowed as of right. The smallest as of right residential lot is a 2-acre lot. There's huge, as you can see, the upper sort of northwest corner of the town is zoned for office or industrial use. With the exception of a small general aviation facility and a handful of buildings here and there, it is basically vacant land. The other large piece to its east is a residential golf course community. And yet this is 14 miles from downtown New Haven, not exactly in the middle of nowhere. So this is exclusionary zoning. And when we look at what we can accomplish by increasing density, next slide, a lot of things come to mind. The first thing is we can meet people's housing needs. We can not, now I'm not, again, realistically, it's not going to do everything. We still need, for an awful lot of American families, we need housing subsidies. We need more vouchers. We need more housing that can be built at below market costs. But before we can do that, assuming those funds might start to become available, we need to have the zoning that can accommodate them. Secondly, it can enhance suburban markets by expanding the market for suburban housing to include young, small families, single individuals, senior citizens, and all kinds of mixed households that are increasing in number, who are not necessarily drawn to the McMansion monoculture of exclusionary suburbs. This can in turn increase and enhance the market position of those suburbs, strengthen their property values, strengthen their property tax base. Next. And the third thing, and this is the critical thing, by densifying suburbs, we can build communities that are going to be fiscally stronger, with stronger property tax bases, economically stronger with stronger housing markets, more environmentally sustainable by reducing sprawl and increasing efficiencies, opportunities for efficient transit. So in other words, the suburbs are benefiting as much as the people who need the housing that needs to be provided. So how do we do this? This is the crux of the question. Next slide, please. Okay, and before I get to talking about the how-tos, I think one important point is made. I think in many respects, many of the people who've been writing and speaking about the suburbs and suburban zoning and zoning issues in general in recent years have, I think, been missing an important point. And I think what I've been seeing, more or less sort of a drumbeat of stuff along the theme is we have got to end single-family zoning. Single-family zoning is inherently bad. Single-family zoning is this, is that. We have to eliminate single-family zoning. Now, I'm not personally wild about single-family zoning, but I don't think that's the issue. I think that's more symbolism than substance, because I don't think there's that. If you took every single-family zone in Connecticut and said, okay, you can tear those houses down and build small multifamily units. You could increase the density by 3 times, say. I'm willing to bet that you would not get a great deal of additional housing. And what you would get is likely to be as expensive as what you're eliminating by doing so. Now, I won't go into the details of the arithmetic on that point. I wrote a piece in Shelter Force that, among other things, looks at the economics of the much heralded Minneapolis rezoning of single family areas and shows how that works. But the point is, that's not where the real opportunities are. And I think what we have to really look at is what are the most productive opportunities for creating additional housing, more diverse housing, and so forth in suburbs. And I'd like to talk about 4 specific proposals that, that can dramatically change the availability of land for affordable housing or housing generally in the typical suburban community. First one, next slide, please. Yeah, the first one is simply to allow accessory apartments to be built inside any single family house that meets reasonable minimum standards, subject only to reasonable code standards to ensure that that apartment will be healthy and safe and meet all reasonable requirements for occupancy. Now, the thing is, an accessory apartment can be as little as 500 or 600 square feet. And almost all of the houses being built in the United States are so much larger than that, that they could easily accommodate an accessory apartment within the unit without any adverse effects on anybody. Now, clearly, there are some straightforward things. You have to make sure there's enough sewer and water capacity, things like that. But an accessory apartment should basically become subject to reasonable standards and as of right use. Now, the interesting thing is many towns in Connecticut and elsewhere have various procedures to permit accessory apartments. Some of them are burdensome. Some of them are extremely burdensome. But the notion that they are a reasonable use of property is not far-fetched. It's not crazy. At least a couple of states have already required local zoning ordinances to permit accessory apartments as of right. So I think this is the first. And the other point, it's worth bearing in mind that if you go to any municipality of any size that does not permit accessory apartments, you will find any number, perhaps hundreds, perhaps even thousands, if it's a very large municipality, of illegal accessory apartments, many of which are not healthy or safe or properly constructed. So accessory apartments are, to my mind, I wouldn't call them exactly low-hanging fruit, but this is something that represents fairly common sense approach to meeting housing needs. And it would dramatically, again, increase the amount of housing. And generally speaking, it would be housing that would be quite affordable relative to the existing housing in most communities. Next slide, please. Okay, the second one is, I mean, we've heard a lot about tiny houses, accessory houses, and what have you. If you have, as they do in Oxford, and by the way, this is not a picture of Oxford, so don't anybody bother to point that out. If you have an area where the typical building lot is a 2-acre lot, and let's say the typical house is a 3,000 square foot, which is far larger than any normal human being needs, but let's pass on that one for the moment. A 3,000 square foot 2-story house. Okay, that house is taking up approximately 2% of the lot area. If you add in the driveway, the walkway up to the house, the swimming pool, and so forth, maybe you've got another 1%. So that leaves 97% of the individual lot basically not being utilized. Now, if you put up a little house like the one in the image in the upper right-hand side of the slide, on that lot. Now that house is about 600 square feet, I think. If you took that house and you put it up on that lot, you would now use an additional slightly less than 1% more of the lot. So you've gone from leaving 97 to 96% of the lot vacant, grass, woods, marijuana plants, whatever. So again, this is another straightforward thing that can be done with minimal impact on the character of the community, the demand for resources, the appearance, et cetera, et cetera. And again, dramatic increases in the number of housing units, and you're creating housing units that can be, again, built relatively inexpensively. You don't have additional land costs. We're talking about small units. You're hooking into an existing infrastructure. Again, relatively affordable housing. Next. Okay, the third one is one of the most visible signs of suburban development is vast amounts of underutilized, or in some cases vacant land in non-residential areas. Office parks. Well, we can go to the next one. Next slide. Okay. Office parks typically contain large amounts of land, which is not really being used for anything over and above the parking area. And in fact, many of them include far more parking than is ever utilized. Commercial strips. Now this is part of, these are images from Berlin Turnpike, which, as a living in Connecticut back in the 60s, before they did I-91, I spent a lot of time on Burlington Turnpike getting between New Haven and Hartford. This is essentially a reservoir of underutilized and vacant land that could be developed for multifamily housing. Could you go back to the previous slide, please? These are examples of the sorts of multifamily infill sites that have been built in different communities around the country. And the interesting thing about the zoning here, I find this is a bit of a inconsistency. When you talk to some suburban people, they will say, well, we can't have multifamily housing because the size, the bulk, the et cetera, is out of character with the community. At the same time, they approve office buildings and office parks, commercial buildings along commercial strips that have as much size, mass, bulk, et cetera, as any of the multifamily developments anybody might seriously consider. So essentially what we'd be saying is that if you just take the existing office and commercial areas and allow people to fill those in with multifamily residential at the same height, bulk, and other requirements from a spatial standpoint as are currently imposed on commercial or office buildings in that municipality, all of a sudden you will create a huge amount of land availability for multifamily housing, which can be affordable, it can be market, it can be mixed income, it can be for senior citizens, for families, whatever. All of a sudden, the land inventory is expanded almost exponentially. And you haven't touched a single square inch of single family residentially zoned land. Next, please. So I would say, personally, that's a great multifamily housing site. What's more, if you got enough multifamily along this or any number of other strips like this, so that you had a critical mass, you could start thinking seriously about using some of that enormous right-of-way, instead of using it entirely for cars, using it either for light rail or more likely for bus rapid transit, and again, dramatically changing the game in terms of transportation, sprawl, fuel consumption, and so forth. So that benefits everybody. Next slide, please. Okay, finally, one of the things that's fascinating to me about suburban development, and it's inevitable by virtue of the way it happens, is that in almost every suburb, there are any number of leftover parcels of significant size interspersed between this subdivision and that subdivision, this subdivision and that office park or industrial park or that commercial strip and so forth, which can be developed without doing violence to any of the existing zoning. So, for example, now this is a piece of land which is in a suburb, not very, as you can see, it's 6.5 miles from downtown Hartford. It's roughly 250 acres. It's got an industrial area on one side. It's close to a major highway. It's got a sort of suburban rural housing going in the other direction. The area is currently zoned, roughly half of it is zoned for industrial use. Roughly half of it is zoned for very low density residential use. This is another amazing site potentially for multifamily housing, or for some kind of mixed use development or mixed housing types. With 250 acres, you can have a lot of fun coming up with a really creative site plan that meets a lot of different housing needs, as well as possibly open space, commercial, you name it. So now, most leftover sites are not 250 acres. But if we talk about, say, sites that are more than 5 acres, there are thousands of them that can be developed with the right kind of buffer. With the right kind of buffering, landscaping, and what have you, so that they can create again opportunities for multifamily housing without, again, having any effect on the character of existing built-up residential neighborhoods. Next slide. So I think my closing point is really very simple. Sort of, what are we waiting for? I think instead of challenging suburbs in some respect. Now, I think, sometimes you have to get their attention. So I'm not suggesting that some of the lawsuits, some of the work that the open communities people are doing is not a good idea. I think it is. But I think it's important to try to get the message out there that this can be a win-win. That there are opportunities to rebuild and densify suburbs that are actually good for the suburbs and good for meeting people's housing needs. Now, I'm not suggesting that everybody is automatically going to agree with that, is that it's not going to be a struggle. Change is always a struggle. But this is a really important issue. I think when it comes to housing production, when it comes to increasing the amount of housing that we can build in order to meet the needs of our population, this is where that battle is either going to be won or lost. It's not going to be won or lost in downtown Bridgeport or Waterbury. It's going to be ultimately about what happens in the suburbs. Thank you, and now I'll be delighted to take questions.
All right. Thank you so much, Alan. That was wonderful. We have a couple questions in the chat in the Q&A window. So again, if you have a question, please please submit it in the Q&A icon at the bottom of your screen. I'll toss these questions to Alan. I have a couple myself, so feel free to keep entering them as we move through. Alan, first question, do you have any suggestions on how to talk with local officials and residents about the value rather than the cost of adding residents to suburbs?
I would I would look at the individual suburb. You know, suburbs are not, there's no such thing as a generic suburb. Each one is different. Each one has a different dynamic, different economic base, different history, and so forth. And I would look at the individual suburb and I would try to identify what their challenges are and also what the specific zoning opportunities might be in that community. And I would start out by, you know, sitting down with local, this may sound kind of, don't take this wrong, but I think by and large, I think you'll find local officials to be somewhat more responsive, at least initially, at least in terms of talking about these things, than sort of random groups of residents. I think they tend to be a little more sophisticated about these issues, a little more attuned to understanding problems of property taxes or the challenges of maintaining a strong housing market or whatever. And I would say, look, here we'd like to work with you to come up with some changes that might be doable without affecting significantly what happens in your single family zones, except again around the accessory apartment issues. And I think you could also argue that allowing owners to create accessory units would actually enhance their property values rather than diminish them. But I think it's got to, you know, it's got to be careful, and they've got to recognize that there's a big residue of suspicion out there.
Thank you. Our second question is about COVID and commercial space, which is actually something I'm also really curious to hear your thoughts on. So the question from Melissa, perhaps it's too soon to say, but I wonder if there are any predictions about an increase in the availability of commercial space due to COVID, either businesses closing or transitioning to virtual work environments. I assume she's talking too about maybe transitioning some of that maybe vacant or underutilized commercial space as we move forward into housing, multifamily housing.
I think it's certainly possible. I mean, again, you know, we don't really know what the even medium term, let's say beyond a year from now, effects of COVID are going to be. So this isn't one I'm going to put my crystal ball hat on about, but I think there is a definite possibility that we're going to lose a lot of small businesses because, you know, they have been clobbered by COVID. And I think even when they're allowed to open up again, there's a lot of evidence that people are reluctant to come back. So a lot of them simply are not going to have the staying power to survive. So I think we're going to lose a lot of businesses. We're also going to lose some office space. We've already been losing office space, demand for office space. We haven't been losing the office space, we've been losing the demand. And now I think this is going to be more true, unfortunately, in downtowns than in suburbs, because I think downtown offices, you know, especially the type A high-end offices, may take the biggest hit of all, because those tend to accommodate the types of operation that can most easily transition to working from home. Can see a lot of big, you know, whether it's tech corporations, professional organizations, and so forth, saying, well, if people are going to work from home a lot, instead of 100,000 square feet, we can manage with 10,000, so forth. I think the New York City market is already seeing an extraordinary number of leases not being renewed, or people coming back and saying, we don't want to renew for 5 years, we want to renew for 1 year, and then we'll see. So I think there are huge issues along those lines, and that's a continuation or an exacerbation of existing trends. We've been losing marginal businesses, marginal office space for the last couple of decades. We have thousands of strip shopping centers and malls in this. No, thousands may be a little strong, say hundreds of strip shopping centers and malls in the United States that are basically zombies, that don't have enough business going on to sustain themselves. Now, some of these here and there's been some really neat examples of people where they've basically repurposed these sites for mixed use developments and things like that. But by and large, there's still an awful lot out there on these traditional strip highways, like the Post Road, Berlin Turnpike, pick your favorite strip highway. So I think there is going to be an increase in vacancy in those areas, and it may create some opportunities for housing, for conversion. The problem is, unlike those wonderful industrial buildings that were built back in the 19th and the early 20th century, which are readily adaptable to housing reuse, most of the post-World War II buildings, commercial and industrial and office buildings, are difficult to adapt to residential use. So in many cases, what you'd end up doing, in all likelihood, is tearing them down in order to create sites that you could build residential on.
Thanks, Alan. That was great. We have a couple of questions I'm just checking my clock here, about 15 minutes left. I'm going to jump to a question from some random guy named Mike Freemuth. Mike pointed out, Mike, for those of you who don't know, is head of the CRDA here in Connecticut. He made a good point, Alan, that actually popped up in my mind too when you were talking about Oxford and ADUs, which is that many of those sort of we'll call suburbs or even slightly beyond suburbs still are heavily reliant on septic and wells as opposed to being connected to infrastructure. So even adding just an additional ADU, as Mike notes, would still put something in the neighborhood of 20 to 25% more pressure on those resources. So I guess the question is, are there other what are your thoughts on sort of how to address or overcome those issues, whether that's state incentives or other programs? But what's your take on the well and septic issue, which again is pretty common here in Connecticut, even in a town like Oxford or similarly situated suburbs, which aren't that far from urban centers?
Yeah, I think that's not just Connecticut. That's true here in New Jersey as well. I live in a small village. We have a sewer system, but we're the only sewer system in miles and miles. All this development on the exurban towns around here is on wells and septics. But I think the question is, and you really have to look at the numbers and look at the actual loads and things like this, whether under the existing environmental conditions and regulations, I would say two things. One is the load on the septic tank and the well such that it can or cannot accommodate an additional 20-25%, which I agree is probably the reasonable level for what you'd expect in terms of increased load. And I'm guessing that in a lot of cases, the answer will be yes. The second one is, if the answer is no, can it be fixed by upgrading the septic system rather than by having to go to a sewer? Because I think in places like Oxford, where the houses are so spread, the cost of going to a sewer system or a piped water system would be prohibitive. I don't think that's a realistic alternative. So I think you will find that in most cases, especially where you have 2-acre or larger zoning, either that increased load can be accommodated with the existing system or can be accommodated through an upgrade in the existing system. And that basically the amount of land available and the separation between the well and the septic are adequate to accommodate the additional load. But there may be some situations where, and I think this should be factored in, there may be some situations where, you know, the environmental people would have to say, no, you cannot add that unit, that accessory house, that tiny house on lots that have this configuration or this particular soil type or what have you, because it's too close to the edge in terms of what is sustainable there. So I'm not sure it would work everywhere, but I'm reasonably confident that it would work in most septic and well situations.
Thanks, Alan. Another question. What thoughts do you have for ensuring that this new residential housing, and by new, but Karen, feel free to specify, I assume you're talking about ADUs and also your discussion on infill multifamily. What thoughts do you have for ensuring that that type of housing includes housing for a full range of incomes?
Okay, I would distinguish between the ADUs and the infill and vacant site development. I think when it comes to ADUs, you're basically talking about an individual homeowner basically making a decision that he or she is going to add a unit in the house or in the backyard. Now, that may be initially because her mother-in-law needs a place to live close to her son and her daughter, and that they want to accommodate her. So I would not impose any restrictions whatsoever in terms of affordability or income screening or so forth on ADUs. I think over time, what is likely to happen is as those houses turn over, a lot of those units are in fact going to increasingly go into the general market rather than being just for so-and-so's mother-in-law, because the next buyer may not have a mother-in-law, but will still want to get some income out of that unit. But because of the nature of the ADU, they are going to stay relatively affordable. Now, when it comes to the multifamily housing or the planned developments or the mixed use housing or so forth that are going to be built in the residential and commercial areas and infill sites, there I think you want to look at perhaps building in an inclusionary requirement that some percentage, perhaps 10% of all of the units in any such development would have to be affordable housing by, you know, appropriate standards. And in fact, maybe even have incentives built in so that if a developer wanted to do more than 10%, they could get higher density or concessions on fees or other things like that. So I definitely think you want to not only I would create a mandatory floor with provisions for encouraging higher percentages. And of course, you'd want to make sure that any developer, say of a low income tax credit or other affordable housing development, would have as much right to develop in those sites, to acquire and build their housing on those sites as a developer of upscale housing.
Thanks, Alan. I'm going to try to get through two more questions. One is, can you point us to any research or written resources you feel would be helpful on framing increasing density in suburbs as an asset? So this kind of goes back a little bit to what we were talking about earlier with having those, you know, one-on-one or small group conversations at the local level about density and increasing density. But is there any other resources out there that could be helpful in framing that conversation and framing density as an asset?
I'm sure there are. I'm not necessarily the person who knows that much about that sort of thing, but there, you know, I think you may have people who are, this is in essence, this is a messaging issue. Is how do you present something in ways that people will respond positively rather than negatively? And so I think you definitely want to talk to the people who are experts about that sort of thing and look at what has been done elsewhere. But I got to admit, this is not my specialty. So I much prefer preaching to the choir.
Thanks. We have a couple of other questions, but I wanted to get back to a question that came in originally about fair share housing. And you and I were talking briefly about this before we jumped on the call, but was wondering what your take, and I'm just trying to pull up the question again. Sorry. Yes, what is your opinion of urging the state to adopt a regional fair share approach to affordable housing, and then using some of the tools you recommended from this presentation as local choices for implementation? Or what is an alternative state framework you've seen used? So fair share, again, was a presentation yesterday from Open Communities Alliance about this concept. I'm sure you've been familiar with its use elsewhere. But what do you think about that here? Or have you seen other alternative sort of frameworks work that you think, based on your knowledge of Connecticut, might work here?
It's a tough one. Fair share has a big advantage and a big disadvantage. The big advantage is it gives you a target with a clear standard that they've got to meet, with a club kind of held in your hip pocket just in case. And that's a real plus. The disadvantage, and this is what we've seen in New Jersey, where you have effective enforcement of fair share and people in the local government realize that, yes, I've got to do it. I can't sort of screw around forever. I've got to do it. It is very effective at getting good zoning for that fair share number. The problem is that's all it gets. So let's say you have a town has a fair share of 250 affordable units. They zone a couple of sites for tax credit projects. Bingo, done. That town conceivably could afford and benefit from 2,000 units of all types of multifamily housing, along with ADUs and so forth, and has the land and the infrastructure and everything else to make it happen. And so by creating a fair share, especially if it's a fair share of affordable housing, you're creating a floor, but you're also creating a cap. So I think that's a problem. It has a plus and a minus. It gets you somewheres, but it doesn't get you where you really want to be. Because a big part of this is, yes, we've got to produce more affordable housing, but we've got to produce more housing, period. And so what the alternative is, well, it's probably not realistic to expect the state to rewrite state zoning law to mandate all of the things that I talked about. But some of them, it might be possible. Like, it strikes me that, putting in a zone, the state zoning law that says, if you allow certain mass, height, and density for commercial or office buildings, you have to permit in those same zones multifamily buildings at the same mass, height, and density. That might not be an impossible thing. I mean, if you think about it, it's got a certain fairly obvious logic to it. So, you may want to look at some of the things like that, along with some broad ADU language in the state zoning law, independent of affordable housing. And you could have both. You could have the fair share and some of the other stuff. The fair share, which would be specific to affordable housing, and then other provisions which would go towards allowing greater density more broadly.
Thank you. On that ADU note, what may be our last question, I'll pass to you from Gabby Nelson, the researcher we were chatting about from Trinity, asked, are there any studies on how many homeowners might add ADUs if they could? Would there be enough homeowners interested in adding an ADU to make a difference in housing supply? Great question, Gabby.
I think there are studies. In fact, I noticed I noticed that Sarah Bronin has put a link to a study done by the regional plan in the Q&A box. So I think there's also been some work on this in California, though I can't offer any links or citations off the top of my head. I think it depends. I think you'll find, interestingly, the experience, sort of, this is more anecdotal, but from working a lot over back in the many years ago on Long Island, trying to get affordable housing built there, generally without success. So there were a lot of ADUs were generally not permitted, and there were a lot of illegal ADUs. But the pattern seems to be that you're more likely to see ADUs created in sort of middle-income suburbs rather than upscale suburbs, because it's the middle-income homeowners who are being hit with, for whom the high taxes and everything else are burdensome, and who need the money, basically. The executives living in New Canaan or wherever, they don't need the money. So it comes basically down pretty much in economics. I mean, Americans as a group are not wild about sharing their houses with other people, in contrast to many European countries where the notion of having a couple living in a house with other apartments is sort of a normal kind of thing. Though, so it's not like everybody is going to create an ADU, but in certain areas, I think it would be significant enough to create a decent number of units that would make a difference.
Thank you. Yeah, and I see that Sarah put up the Regional Plan Association just came out with a report about ADUs, and Sarah's posted the link in the Q&A function for those of you who are interested. And we'll also have that report available on our website too.
I think the American Planning Association may also have some good materials on ADUs.
Yeah, excellent. Well, we have run out of time, and if we could, we'd keep you here for another hour because I think we get enough questions. We didn't even get to them all today. So I'm sure that I'll bother you to come back and speak with the partnership at some point in time. But for now, we really appreciate all the great information you've just provided us with. This recording of this webinar will be available on the partnership website soon, which is pschousing.org, for those of you who are interested. Again, I encourage you to check out Alan's most recent book, The Divided City. You have read it. Yeah. And again, just a note that you'll see a poll pop up at the end of the session here. Please take a moment to fill that out. The next session after this is about what's new in Connecticut housing data tools. It is starting right now. So again, thank you, Alan. Thanks so much for being with us this morning. Thank you, all of you who participated and submitted such great questions. We really appreciate it. I hope you all have a wonderful day. Thanks again.
Thank you, Kylie, and thank all of you for listening and asking questions.
Of course. All right. Thanks, everyone.
So long.